All right, so what I have open now is the next kind of fern technique, which is to do your ferns where you just have a big leaf and you just texture it with an alpha channel to make it look like there's a bunch of little leaves in there. And so it's simpler in a way, meaning that it's less geometry. So you can see that these palm, or rather, it starts with a palm leafy stroke, which I then make some changes to, not too much, like we were doing earlier, to just make the leaves a little bit wider at the base and have very, very short twigs inside there. And then we'll see that the poly count on these is about 1,000 polys each. So this one's 2,000, as opposed to the ferns we did earlier that were, about 10,000 polys each. So it just saves a little bit of polys. So again, it's a matter of are these in the foreground or the background. Now here I do have a foreground one, and if I open a render view window, you can see that it looks all right. And so the thing is that the angle or orientation of all of the individual leaves coming off of the main stem are kind of the same, as opposed to with the other technique where we could use turbulence and randomize things a little bit to offset that. But you can see it still looks pretty good. And obviously for ferns that would be small and in the background in a scene, it's going to work really well. And so as far as the geometry goes, let me just hide a bunch of stuff we don't need. I imported some trees in here just to get some shadows cast. And I've got a bunch of particle and dynamic stuff that we don't need. So I'll hide that. So, and let me hide that plane that's emitting particles. Okay, so I've got a few of these, but if we just look at the original stroke that created them, stroke palm leafy, display show selection, it's just this guy. And so with it, you can see that as far as changes from the preset, I really just made the twigs really, really short inside there. And so, and then the leaf, again, is just emitting at the end of each one of those twigs. So if we were to create something similar, it would take very little time. It'd just be a matter of going to Visor, grabbing Plants Mesh, Palm Leafy, drag one in here, make it way bigger, and then we would try to decide what changes we would need to make it similar. Then we just would go inside here, and we know that I want to make some quick changes. So if I go under growth and hide the leaves for a second, I just want to go and make those twigs a lot shorter. And then the angle that they emit off of a little bit more perpendicular to the start tube that they're emitting off. So you can see I don't have branches, just twigs. So make them a little bit shorter. I don't necessarily need so many segments on them, so I could of course go under mesh. First of all, it could be set to 4. And then under creation, number of segments I could put, let's say, to 8. So it's just not so heavy because they're so short. So just shorter little twigs, maybe even shorter. And then as far as the leaves go, once those pop on, then if I just want to get these to be a little bit more default, I'll go to the leaf and we can see there's all sorts of stuff changing the shape. So I'm going to want to change or just get rid of all of that for a second. And then I'll just leave the length scale. If I put it to default of 1, I can then just take this guy at the end and insert a point so they taper to a point. Leaf start, I want them to begin at the end of the twig. If I want them to be a little wider at the base, I can just increase my base width a little bit. And if I want to adjust the shape, of course, I can go and insert more points. Then I need leaf face sun. And let's just get the stiffness up a little bit on here. And then curl, you can see, has a whole bunch of points on this preset. So I'm just going to go and maybe have a little bit of curl that flattens out a little bit. I might add, at this point now, I can play with the stiffness. I'm going to go and I want to adjust my twig angle at the end there, because you can see it was a little too vertical, so a little bit more perpendicular to the start tube. I have a little bit too much curl, or let's say leaf bend, so I can go and reduce the leaf bend. And that's pretty much it. Now it's just a matter of inserting more of them in here, more twigs. So if I now go in and say, all right, well, I want more twigs, so I go up here and I'll increase the number of twig clusters. And then for my leaves, leaf location, I want it only on the twigs. You see I was getting that one that's shooting straight up because it's emitting off the end of the start tube. So on twigs only. And then now, of course, I could go in and say, well, maybe I want to go to my twigs. I can now mess with the angle at the base, angle at the tip, maybe up a little bit more. And then twigs start, maybe they start a little higher up the start tube. And so here we have another basic fern start point. So, and we could add a little deflection. So I'll go down to forces, add a little bit of deflection in there. I can adjust where that deflection starts. We could add in a little bit more gravity. Of course, we can play with random if we want to. And that's our basic start point for a fern using this method. So it's a little bit different than the one over here, but it's the same general idea. The difference on this one is that the start tube is a little taller, but it's actually nice having it short. Those twigs that are in there could definitely be a little bit shorter, so I just go to twig length and shorten those down. Okay. So that's the basics of the geometry. So I think it should be clear to you what things you could change to modify the general result. So there's a lot of different types of ferns. There's no one type. So obviously it's a matter of looking at reference to decide what you're trying to replicate, because there are ferns that the leaves do stand up straight, or a lot more straight than this, which means going to my twig angle and just getting them to be a little bit more vertical. So, but for this guy, we'll keep them down a little bit. So what we want to adjust now, or look at, is the shader that we would create for either of these types of ferns. And so let's go in and convert these to poly. So modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. And then inside here with that one, I can see that when I converted it, the curl is kind of in the wrong direction from what I want. So I'm going to delete that conversion, go to the stroke, go to the leaf curl, and actually invert it at the beginning. And flatten it out a little bit. Maybe a little bit more curl there. Okay. Although, fern leaves can be curled, can be straight. But now that I did that, modify, convert, paint effects to polygons. Now they're oriented correctly. Hide the stroke. And we could also take this guy and convert that one. So modify, convert, paint effects to polygons, and hide that stroke. So now we have geometry. So as far as the shader goes, if I open Hypershade, there's going to be a few things in here that are irrelevant. So just because there's some shaders for the trees I imported. So what we're interested in is the fern branch and the fern leaf. So the fern branch is simple. So we can see we just have a gamma correct with a green color on it. So again, the branch is so small you're not really going to notice it, so I don't really worry about that. And then for the leaf, I'm going to assign that to the leaves. Now in here this isn't a 3x3, so I don't have to use the script to randomize or adjust the UVs. And we can see it's a normal leaf shader where we have a color map, a bump map, a spec map, translucency map. And in regards to the texture, that's kind of what we want to look at. So, but before we do that, so let's just go and do a quick render just so we can see what we get. And so I know that I have a texture on the ground in here, which we don't need. And I also want to see where my sun direction is. So there's our sun. It's fine. Let me just put a simple shader on the ground, so just a gray material. Let me render a little smaller. And then since the texture has a lot of small detail on it, because it's trying to create, the look of the twig with the leaves coming off of it and the leaves coming off of those, my quality, I'm going to set my adaptive sampling to 2. Usually for test renders I have it at 1, but up at 2. And so now let's render this and see what we get. And let's also save our scene real quick. So we're going to save this to scenes, and this is Toot Fern 01. And that's from the earlier one. This is Fern B01. And I'm going to do a render. And do that again. I get an error when I render for the first time in Mental Ray just because I'm using Mental Ray Satellite. So when I launch a render, it's actually rendering on 3 computers. But for some reason, every time I hit render for the first time, I get an error. But it always works the second time, for whatever reason. Okay, so you can see, there you go. So it's a pretty simple texture, obviously, in there that's creating the look of this fern, which obviously you can use this technique to make palm trees too, because it kind of has that look. But with that, if we take a look at the amount of detail that's in the texture, so if I get a lot closer and render, basically what I did is I just scanned some fern leaves and made my own fern texture. And so as I get closer to it, we can see that we're getting, the bump depth is obviously a little bit too deep. But we have the twig going down the center, we have the leaves coming off of them, and the leaves coming off of those. And so it's something that's working relatively well. So again, not necessarily for a hero fern, although we can see in this render that it actually looks, pretty decent up close to camera. It's just the lighting is a little nicer in this scene than the test render we just did. But it's the same exact shader. And so for creating that texture, really simple. Let me just show you in Photoshop what it is. So let's jump to Photoshop for a sec. All right, and in Photoshop, these are the textures that I created. And so let me just start at this PSD. And so what I did is I, as you can see, scanned some leaves. And with the scan that I did, I scanned like 4 different leaves. So let me just go and hide a bunch of these groups that are inside here. And let's pick one that's there. I scanned 6 different leaves. And so here what we're seeing is, let's say, I'm going to have that one on, and let's say group 2 on. Yeah. Okay. So those are the 6 leaves that I scanned. And so it's just a fern that I just found outside. And instead of trying to scan the entire fern leaf with all of its tapering, I actually, as you can kind of see, tore off these leaves and scanned them individually, or I just put all 6 of them on the scanner. Because I don't want the tapering. I want because the tapering is actually in here, in the geometry. And so, but the UVs for any one of these leaves, if I select one of these leaves and grab the whole leaf, as you know, the UVs are square. And so basically with the way that I'm doing this is I've got this texture that's just straight and square, and it's tileable. I made it a tileable texture. And then as my geometry tapers, so will the little leaves. And then the nice thing about making a tileable texture is that I can control how many repeats there are in V to determine how many or how tightly packed the leaves are on one of these fern branches. And so going back to Photoshop, I scan the leaves, and leaves, when I scan them, have a little bit of a curl to them. And so I went in and positioned them so that they're, just curling the right way. And then with the fern that I scanned, the leaves are actually emitting off of their stem, alternating. And so they're not, so the way that you saw with Maya was that they were kind of like 2 and 2. Well, here you can see it's that you wouldn't really be able to do that with paint effects. So for my texture, I'm doing it that way, which is a little bit more realistic. So they alternate. And then I took these individual leaves, so you can see they're all sitting inside a group. And obviously I scanned them and used the magic wand tool to separate them from the background. So simple enough. And I put those in a group. And so I have the left side and the right side. And then I basically just made a whole bunch of copies of these groups in Photoshop, like so. And so I just alternated them. So I took this copy, or this group, copied it, moved it here, flipped it horizontally, just so there's a little bit of randomness, excuse me, along the edge. And I created just a simple stem down the middle, which is nothing really. It's just a solid color going down, but you know, I'm never going to be that close to it. And that's pretty much it. And so, you know, as far as making it tileable, that's just a matter of, you know, offsetting your document. So making tileable textures is something that I'm sure you know how to do. So I just use other offset, which it won't let me do right now on a group node. I had to flatten it first to test the positioning. So meaning that I have these groups, you know, so like this group is at the bottom down there, which is group 1-4 copy. And so this group right there is group 2 copy. So basically the ones that are down there are obviously going off through the bottom. So, but when I go and offset the document, I can go and test it. So I knew that since I had the same group at the top as I have down at the bottom, then this one up here is going off the top, this is going off the bottom. But then to test the positioning of it, all I did was duplicate my image, and then in the copy, I can just flatten it, and then just do filter other. And my image size right now is 2200 by 2200. So if I offset it vertically by 1100 pixels, I can see that as I offset, so you can see as I do this, it's tiling perfectly. So the offset tool just allows you to test your tile, which is cool. So once I had this inside here, then obviously I just needed to, all of these have alpha channels, so I just merge visible, right? So basically if I go and have everything visible, and I say merge visible, then I can select the pixels by right-clicking and selecting the pixels, and then I can say save selection, and that becomes my alpha channel. So you can see now I have this as an alpha channel. So this is my alpha, and this is my RGB. And so the only other thing I do for the RGB is I just fill it with a green background inside there and make a grayscale version of it. So meaning that if we close that for a second and we open the actual front color, so we can see what I actually did. I created the background with a gradient. We can see there's the alpha channel. So obviously there is a lot of detail inside there. And having this gradient inside there just is sort of forcing that the edges of these leaves, you know, are going to be a little bit darker in the center, a little bit darker or lighter out here. And then I also blur the edges of them a little bit, which gives nicer results with your cutout opacity sometimes, especially when there's a lot of detail in it like that. And so if I was going to actually go and do that so it's not so confusing, what I mean is I would go in here and merge visible. So I got that. I would, next step is select the pixels for it and save my alpha channel. So I now have my alpha channel. And then I made a background. And so what I did is I just grabbed, you know, a dark green from there, grab a light green from the end inside there. So I now have these two greens. And then I just fill with a gradient. So if I go in here and fill with a gradient, it's a linear gradient, and then fill on the other side with the color to transparent. that gives me that. But you can see that these still have very hard edges to them. So I then go to my color and I duplicate it. The one that's underneath I blur. So I just put like a Gaussian blur of a few pixels on it. And then I take the one on top and I load my selection, which is my alpha channel. But then I go to select, modify, contract, which will shrink my selection. So if I shrink it by, let's say, 2 pixels, you can see it gets a little smaller. I then blur that edge, so modify feather by 2 pixels, and then select the inverse, so I'm selecting instead of the leaves the background, but it'll grab the edges of these with a nice soft selection, and I hit delete. So now you can see I have that blurred background and then the one in focus on top, but with a nice soft edge to it. And so this just tends to work a little bit better. And so basically this I now flatten, and that's my color, and that's my alpha. And so as far as for this, since I only scan the front of the leaves, then I can make a copy of it. So let's just delete that. So this guy could be my front color, and this guy could be my back color. And usually for back color, I just lower the saturation and increase the lightness a little bit. So, but you have to look at your leaf that you're using as reference to try and figure out what's going to be appropriate. And that would be my back color. And then duplicate it. And then get rid of the saturation. Adjust levels. And this would be my bump map. And I can always adjust bump depth in Maya. So that's the bump. And then for the speck, I know that I want my speck to be pretty close to white. So if I duplicate this bump and adjust levels, I would just boost the black point up inside here. So because you know we're usually using a value of white for the reflection color, so I want to keep it really, really bright, just have a little bit of variation. And I can always adjust the contrast in there. And then that is my speck. So that's how I created the texture for the fern. So if we go back to Maya, then basically that's what we're looking at inside these renders. So just an alternate way to make ferns. And so basically I've shown you one method of doing it via geometry in Paint Effects and another just doing it via big leaves and Paint Effects with a texture. So both of them are perfectly effective, and that's pretty much ferns, I think. Yeah. So all of the stuff that has to do with, trees and particles and instancing and whatnot is all in later DVDs, which is also like, really, really thoroughly covered in those. But as far as, the focus of this DVD, which is just making plants with Paint Effects, hopefully you now have a pretty strong grasp on it. So I know it's been long, and hopefully not too long, but it's just trying to, drive the point home on how this stuff is done by reiterating and being, in the end, kind of redundant by just sort of doing the same kind of thing in different ways. So we had to sort of first evaluate the whole Paint Effects library and talk about shaders and double-sided materials and MIA materials and all that kind of stuff. But so it's a lot of different things we've talked about. But if we jump into Photoshop again and take a look at our little forest path scene, then basically what we're dealing with in here is, as far as the plants go, everything we just talked about. So all of these plants are derived. The bush is the one that we created in the tutorial together. And so these, you've all seen how these have been made. And so the other stuff that's in here, we saw how to use the Ivy tool. So in the scene file in Maya, I just selected the geometry for the trunk, exported it as an OBJ, and imported that into IvyGen, played around with the settings until I was happy with the way it that on those leaves. So there you go. So to build a scene like this, while there are a few things that we have not talked about, that's going to be coming next. So, the next thing we're going to get into is how to do grass, and we'll be using grass as the example to get very involved in the instancer and how to use particles, emitters, textures, and all that kind of stuff with a variety of other things we talk about. We do talk about plants a little bit too in the next DVD. And then we move on to how to do trees with paint effects and how to do trees with onyx. And so it all kind of culminates in you having the abilities to be able to create scenes like this really, really quickly. Because again, this is about a day and a half from scratch. And so it really, really goes fast once you have, an arsenal of techniques and you start to build your library. You start building a paint effects library that you export, that you can import into any scene that has shaders and textures already assigned to them, like we've been talking about. So when I build a scene like this, I did build all the paint effects plants from scratch, but the trees I had and the rocks I had and the textures for all my leaves and stuff I already have. So it's easy to sort of get things blocked out. So if we jump back to Maya and let's just go and real quick open that forest scene. We'll just take a look at it in a little bit more depth, just for a second, just so we can see how some of the paint effects plant related stuff was incorporated. And so let's do that. And let's close that. And all right, so we've got the scene loaded. All right, so let's talk about this scene a little further.